The two belligerents in the Gaza Strip have reached a deal on the prisoner and the hostage swap.
This is the ceasefire agreement I introduced last spring. Today, Hamas and Israel have agreed to that ceasefire agreement.
That was the Prime Minister of Qatar and the President of the US announcing the news everyone has been waiting for, but which finally happened on Wednesday night. A deal between Israel and Hamas for a ceasefire and some other things in the war in Gaza. We'll discuss what it means, how the deal was reached, and what could happen next on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and this episode of Newscast will be entirely focused on the news that came out of Qatar on Wednesday evening, that there is finally, after a lot of waiting and a lot of wrangling, a deal between Israel and Hamas for a ceasefire in Gaza. It comes in 3 stages, and we will talk you through all the different stages and what they mean, and some of the pitfalls that there could still be before the deal is even implemented, because it does not come into force until Sunday. So here to help us, we've got some of the BBC's best journalistic minds. Joining me in the studio is diplomatic correspondent and big friend of the podcast, James Landale. Hi, James.
Hello.
And Sarah Smith is in Washington. Hello, Sarah.
Hi there.
Right, we're recording this episode at 7:45 on Wednesday evening. That's 7:45 UK time. James, just before we dive into the details of this deal, just tell us how the last few hours have unfolded and what it's been like in the newsroom.
Well, if you think about it, we've been waiting for this for some time. And when you know a deal is about to be done or some big news event is about to happen, you're constantly trying to calibrate how much do we report about the preparations and the waiting and the expectation without slightly over-egging it and without also creating a sense of inevitability that might not be there if there is some hitch or delay to a deal. So in the last sort of few days and hours, we've been trying to sort of, remind the audience that these talks are going on, these discussions are happening, and people are talking optimistically, but being cautious about it and saying, but this is the framework and this is what's happening. And then, of course, when it happens, nothing's clear. It dribbles out. First of all, you get a statement from one side or another bit, and it's an unofficial source or it's an anonymous source, so that you're building up cautiously a picture until you can sort of, look for those firm sort of planks in a sea of initially uncertain news, constantly trying to give the audience just a sense of, well, this is what we know so far and this is what we don't know. And that'll carry on, I think, for some days until we see full text.
Yeah, because there is no black and white version of this deal. And Sarah, we're having to just take what the Qatari Prime Minister has said in a news conference and then what President Biden said in some remarks in the White House to try and work out actually what's been agreed here.
Yeah, and they describe basically the same thing. With all of these kind of agreements, the devil is in the fine detail, and that's what it will have taken so long to negotiate. But we know the broad sweep of it, a ceasefire that will last for 6 weeks, that will include the withdrawal of Israeli forces from populated areas of Gaza, a number of hostages being released by Hamas, including women, the elderly, and the wounded, is what President Biden said. They'll be the first hostages to be released, and also that some Palestinian prisoners in Israel will also be released. So, and that was always going to be the broad shape of the deal. And of course, it's taken all these months to really pin down the detail. But yeah, we know that roughly that's how the next few weeks are going to proceed.
And also, Sarah, Joe Biden said, I know the details of this deal because I, Joe Biden, am the one that proposed it in May last year.
Indeed, he said this is the exact framework that we proposed in May. Now, that tells you 2 things. One, just quite how long it has taken to negotiate this, and how much human suffering would have been avoided if the various parties had agreed much closer to May to do this. But of course, he is saying that as well as a statement of ownership, because you've got this deal coming just as he's about to leave the White House in 4 days' time. And you've got Donald Trump, of course, coming in. I mean, Donald Trump leapt on social media, on his own platform, on Truth Social, to announce that a deal had been done before we'd had any kind of official confirmation of it at all. He said that this was an epic victory in the Middle East and that the hostages were going to be coming home. And he can claim some credit, I think, for having put enough pressure on Israel particularly to sign up to this deal. He's been making threatening noises in the last few days. He said publicly that if the hostages aren't released before he's sworn into office on Monday, all hell will break loose. He didn't explain what that exactly meant, but, I think everybody got the gist that he was very, very keen that this deal get done. And so he's claiming the credit for having tipped it over the line because he's coming into office. And of course, Joe Biden wants to claim the credit because it's happened whilst he's in office.
And I think Chris Mason is here. Hi, Chris.
Hello.
What's Keir Starmer been saying?
So we've just had, as we record, a written statement from the Prime Minister. I suspect in time we'll hear from senior figures in front of the cameras. A handful of paragraphs. Perhaps it's one of those newscasts where I'll just read the whole thing out. So the Prime Minister said, after months of devastating bloodshed and countless lives lost, this is the long overdue news that the Israeli and Palestinian people have been desperately waiting for. They have borne the brunt of this conflict, triggered by the brutal terrorists of Hamas, who committed the deadliest massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust on October the 7th, 2023. The hostages who were brutally ripped from their homes on that day and held captive in unimaginable conditions ever since can now finally return to their families. But we should also use this moment to pay tribute to those who won't make it home, including the British people who were murdered by Hamas. We will continue to mourn and to remember them. For the innocent Palestinians whose homes turned into a war zone overnight, and the many who've lost their lives, this ceasefire must allow for a huge surge in humanitarian aid, which is so desperately needed to end the suffering in Gaza. And then our attention, the Prime Minister writes, must turn to how we secure a permanent, better future for the Israeli and Palestinian people, grounded in a two-state solution that will guarantee security and stability for Israel alongside a sovereign and viable Palestine state. The UK and its allies will continue to be at the forefront of these crucial efforts to break the cycle of violence and secure long-term peace in the Middle East. So that's the statement from Downing Street, just as the Qatari press conference was finishing.
Although, James, that makes me realise we haven't really heard from Israel or Hamas, the two sides in this negotiation. We've heard from everyone who's facilitated it or fed into it, but not the people who were actually, well, they weren't negotiating with each other because it was through intermediaries, but we haven't got their words yet.
Not official, not on the record. The Israelis at the moment are still saying there are a few wrinkles that need to be sorted out. We do know that there are some signals that the Israelis are going to go through a sort of formal political process tomorrow. There have to be various votes in various parts of the Israeli cabinet for any kind of deal to be sort of signed off, because obviously one of the big question marks is, how does the Israeli political system respond to this deal, particularly those ultra-nationalists, those two crucial fellows upon whom this coalition currently hangs? What do they do? They've expressed their opposition to, reports of this deal. Do they walk? If they do walk, what happens to the government? We know that the opposition parties in Israel have said that they will vote to support the government to keep the deal alive. But there is the potential for political uncertainty off the back of this.
This ceasefire does not kick in until Sunday. So it's a sort of a done deal, but not on the ground it isn't.
Well, and the Prime Minister of Qatar, when he was making his statement, made it very, very clear that, this will start on Sunday. And that means that, he made a plea to all sides to desist from fighting between now and then. But he knew that was a possibility, which was why he was making that plea, because he doesn't want some act of violence to upset the diplomatic cart here. There's a lot of time can happen between now and then for the potential for violence.
And just wanted to zoom in on one word in particular, the word populated. And that's the idea that Israeli troops will begin pulling out of populated areas of Gaza. Now, I'm no expert, but to me that screams out that there will still be Israeli troops allowed to be in some areas of Gaza, the non-populated ones.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is very, very clear. In this first phase, there will be some withdrawal of Israeli forces from parts of Gaza. We don't know precisely where. As you say, the only detail we've had so far was that crucial word from President Biden when he said that there will be a withdrawal of Israeli forces from populated parts of Gaza. We know that phase 2 is when, in theory, there's a permanent ceasefire, permanent end to the war, and all Israeli forces leave Gaza. But that's still to be negotiated. So, in other words, there's still a lot of detail here that we don't know precisely. Where will Israeli forces move from? There's been lots of talk of buffer zones in some areas. There'll be continuing controversy over this so-called Philadelphia corridor in the south, the border effectively between Gaza and Egypt. Because if you remember, just a few months ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu was saying that Israeli forces will stay there forever. And because if the Israeli forces were not in the Philadelphia corridor permanently, there would never be any kind of peace, because there would be smuggling of arms across the border. So they had to be there. We still don't know. Has he weakened that commitment?
And Sarah, talking about that word permanently, a lot of Joe Biden's statement was about what happens in Gaza in the medium term. So after phase 2 of these negotiations and after phase 3, and he spent quite a lot of time talking about the entire Middle East.
Yes, he did. And one of the things he told us about phase 2 and 3 that I thought was very interesting was that we're talking about a 6-week ceasefire in phase 1 and some of the hostages being released. And during those 6 weeks, some details still have to be ironed out about phase 2, where you're getting to a permanent ceasefire and the remaining hostages being released. If that has not been agreed during that 6-week period, the ceasefire will be extended, he says, to allow those negotiations to continue. So they don't envisage a return to hostilities, even if they haven't managed to nail down all the details of a permanent ceasefire within the next 6 weeks. But yeah, both Joe Biden and Donald Trump, frankly, have been thinking about the future of the Middle East. Joe Biden had his own ideas about how this should play out. He has always been a very strong supporter of a two-state solution, and that Palestinian statehood was something that he mentioned yet again. Now, he's departing the world stage, of course, and he won't have a huge amount of influence on that. Donald Trump, in some of his social media posts, has been talking about the focus he will maintain on the Middle East, but he is interested in, he said, making sure that Gaza does not become a haven for terrorists. And he will want to look at the balance of power within the Middle East, where he's Iran, which who of course have been, allied with Hezbollah and Hamas, seen as a great opponent of the United States by Donald Trump. So he will want to make sure that Iran remains contained. But he did say that he wants to carry on with the diplomatic efforts, which he was quite successful with in his first term. If you remember, they signed the Abraham Accords, the normalization of relations between Israel and UAE. He wants to carry on and do that with Saudi Arabia and Israel signing a deal together. So he is signaling that he does intend to remain very involved in the Middle East. And of course, it will be under his administration that they implement and monitor what happens with this peace deal over the next 6 weeks and over the longer term.
James, do you want to make a point there?
And what Sarah's saying about Saudi Arabia and normalization is absolutely crucial, because that's where the diplomatic crunch will really come, because the Saudis have been making it very, very clear that unlike the previous Abraham Accords or those deals between Israel and the countries in the Gulf, where basically they turned a blind eye to what's called the Palestinian issue. That is no longer going to happen. And the Saudis have been making very, very clear that, yes, they want normalization with Israel because, there are huge benefits to all sides, but it must involve a Palestinian state. And the point is that is unacceptable to the Israeli government as currently constituted, and it is unacceptable to many of Donald Trump's supporters. And so that is the question, is how does Donald Trump turn any kind of ceasefire that may or may not hold into a wider political deal? Because at the moment, the Saudis are making it very, very clear it has to involve, the fabled two-state solution. And that's what, Secretary Blinken was talking about in his speech yesterday as well, of saying, look, there has to be a political horizon here for some kind of settlement for this to move beyond sort of phases 1 and maybe phase 2.
And Chris, that sense of hope for the long-term future is something that Keir Starmer has to offer, because that's how he heals some of the domestic political wounds that have been opened up because of this conflict.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's two sort of points to reflect on as far as the UK is concerned, and it seems minor in the grand scheme of what we're talking about. But you've got a new government that has been adjusting to office, arrived in office with two conflicts that it had to deal with geopolitically, diplomatically, Ukraine and the Middle East. And in the context of the Middle East, against that backdrop where, if you like, the arguments around the conflict were playing out in the general election campaign here last year, particularly in urban parts of England with a substantial Muslim population, where there was significant sympathy for the plight of the Palestinians and the suffering in Gaza. We saw electoral consequences for that, for Labour in the general election, and they have been very conscious of that. So what will be interesting to see in the coming weeks and months, as I say, I'm conscious as I say this, it seems quite parochial in the context of our conversation on Newscast, but how developments and how things play out in the coming weeks and months might read across to implications here at home.
And James, just to go back to the contents of the deal, which we've still not seen, so sorry to put you on the spot about that, but what about the humanitarian situation in Gaza? Both this idea that more aid will be able to get in because it's basically been a trickle the whole time, and then just to the future rebuilding it, because we've all seen the pictures of it's basically rubble now.
Well, in terms of humanitarian support, that is definitely a clear part of phase one and has to begin very, very quickly. Simply because the need is there. So the moment the fighting stops, if the fighting stops, the plan is that, in theory, the bureaucratic restrictions and constraints on the flow of aid become eased. But there are huge problems here. Do we have the capacity? Is there the right amount of aid in the right places? Is it ready to go? What is the security situation on the ground within Gaza's borders? Because we know there have been security problems and looting of aid convoys and things like that. So that is going to be a huge part of the story in coming days, does that aid get through? Is the right aid getting through? Simply to alleviate the incredibly acute need that's right on the ground. You mentioned the word reconstruction, right? That is in a completely different space at the moment. That is part of phase three, if it happens, because the big question, of the future of Gaza, the day after, is it?
Well, who runs it?
Who runs it? What's the governance? Who keeps it secure? How does you keep its borders protected? What role is there for the international community in that? What role is there for the Europeans, for the Gulf countries, but also, fundamentally, who's going to pay to reconstruct Gaza in the long run? Yes, there's a lot of international money out there, but remember, I remember sitting in conferences where we talked about reconstructing Syria. Well, we're still not reconstructing Syria yet. That might happen slightly sooner, but equally, I've sat in conferences talking about the reconstruction of Ukraine.
Yeah.
So, do you know what I mean? There's a lot of concrete that's going to have to be built.
And Sarah, inevitably this conversation's ended up being maybe a bit wonkish just because of where we all sit and the format of this podcast. But we've got to remember at the heart of this is Israeli families who've been separated for 460 something days because their loved ones are being held hostage, and tens of thousands of dead Gazans. There's a very emotional, real life people's lives element to this. It's not just, have we seen the text, where are the square brackets in the paragraph, what's the different phasing?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we've seen the appalling suffering that there has been across Gaza, and everybody hopes that that will be alleviated now, and that some of that humanitarian, the US are talking about surging humanitarian aid into Gaza, which we know it's absolutely desperately needed. Yes, and the agony of these families who've been waiting for hostages to return, some of whom are here in the United States, and it seems pretty clear that the American hostages will very much be part of the phase one release. But I thought it really drove it home to me how difficult this situation must be for the hostages' families, who don't know, of course, whether their loved ones are alive or well, or how they have been treated during the time that they have been held hostage. Because in phase three, if we get there in this deal, phase three is when all remains of deceased hostages are to be returned to their families. And when you get to that bit of the deal, it caught me up a bit short, actually, and just really reminded you of how very, very serious this is for the people who've been caught up in it.
And Chris, you've got to go, but do you want to make a last point from the UK's perspective?
I think from a UK foreign policy perspective, I know from speaking to people in the last sort of hour or so who've been sort of involved in this and keeping an eye on this, that, of course, and you've seen it reflected in the language from the Prime Minister, there is a sense of relief that this point has been reached, coupled with a sense of, if you like, a world-weary trepidation about what might come next and a desire not to assume that necessarily the paths ahead will be straightforward. But a hope, as will be shared by so many, that this is a significant and as big a turning point in this conflict since that horrific day on October the 7th, and that from a very sort of parochial UK foreign policy perspective, that maybe, just maybe, the kind of issues that the Foreign Secretary and others confront, particularly the two conflicts that I refer to, and I think we'll hear plenty of conversation in the coming days, by the way, around Ukraine with the imminence of Donald Trump's inauguration, that one of those two grim, very live conflicts might be moving into a phase that is a little different, and from that, I think that from that perspective, there will be a sense of relief.
Chris, thank you very much, and Sarah, thanks to you too.
Thanks. Always good to talk, Adam.
And James, just one last putting you on the spot question. You talked about monitoring the situation in Gaza over the next 16 days or 6 weeks, depending on which bit of the phases you're looking at. Do we know how that monitoring is going to be done?
Yeah, no, that was the subject of quite a lot of the questioning in the news conference with the Qatari Prime Minister. And essentially his answer was that a new unit is going to be set up of Qataris, Egyptians, Americans. In other words, part of the negotiating team, the mediators, who will monitor implementation of the deal and call out any party that is not following the deal as agreed. I mean, a lot of the questioning was, what happens if this collapses? What happens if there's a problem? What if somebody reneges on it? Or if there's a logistical problem, a bus doesn't deliver somebody on time, the wrong prisoner is released from an Israeli jail. Maybe, there's a mix-up with which hostage. And because remember, not all the hostages, we think, are held by Hamas. Some are held by other militias. So there's a potential for these things going wrong. And I think one of the questions we still don't really know the answer to is how much reconciliation process is built into that to, in other words, allow for these kind of things. So that at this stage, in other words, to protect it, to give it this agreement some resilience so it doesn't collapse because of some logistical problem. But yeah, if there is going to be a team, and an official team, who are going to be monitoring it, the Qatari Prime Minister said, look, we are relying on the good faith of all parties here. So, people have put their paw prints to a document, but they have to make it happen.
And I think what's so interesting about that, from my perspective as a very outside observer, is that I'd always thought throughout this process, it was the positions of the parties to the negotiations that made it hard. But I've just realised from listening to you tonight, it was hard as well. Just the problems were hard as well as the positions.
It is multi-dimensional, logistical, diplomatic chess with so many different moves. And if you think about it, many of these negotiations had to take place. We've talked about negotiators being in the same building and then in the same town, but a lot of the time, the negotiations with the Hamas leadership had to be, messages had to be sent to people hiding in tunnels, being pursued by IDF forces in Gaza. That makes communication hard. So to a certain extent, there was a logistical sort of slowness built into these discussions that meant that things took quite a long time until it reached a stage where both parties wanted to make a deal.
James, thank you very much.
My pleasure, as always.
And thanks to you too for listening to this episode of Newscast with this big piece of breaking news on Wednesday evening. Bye-bye.